At a military funeral held with perfect precision, security turned away an elderly man in worn clothes who had no credentials and no invitation. He didn't argue or protest, just stood at the gate looking toward the flag-draped casket with quiet urgency. The guards were seconds from removing him entirely when a four-star general froze the entire ceremony, walked directly to the perimeter, and called the stranger by name. What happened next would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew about the Admiral being buried that day. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories like this move you, please subscribe, because what the general revealed would leave 300 people standing in stunned silence. November 17th arrived cold and clear over Arlington National Cemetery. Leaves scattered across white headstones in patterns that shifted with each gust of wind. The air carried the scent of autumn earth and fresh-cut grass, the kind of morning that felt made for remembrance. Rows of navy dress blues and marine scarlet formed precise lines across the lawn, each uniform pressed to perfection, each salute crisp and unwavering. Politicians in dark suits clustered near the front, their voices hushed and respectful. The flag hung at half-mast against a pale sky, and somewhere in the distance, a bugler practiced scales that floated like ghosts between the monuments. This was the funeral of Rear Admiral Dalton Mercier, 3 decades of service, 2 Bronze Stars, command of the Pacific Fleet's submarine force. Every protocol had been followed to the letter, every honor rendered with military precision, every guest accounted for and verified. Security checkpoints dotted the perimeter like sentries, manned by Marines in dress blues who checked clipboards with practiced efficiency. Radio chatter crackled softly as guards confirmed positions and reported clear sectors. Everything was controlled. Everything was ordered. Everything was exactly as it should be. At the inner perimeter, a flag-draped casket rested on a caisson pulled by 6 white horses, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. 4-star General Rowan Ashford stood near the front, stone-faced and rigid, his chest heavy with ribbons that told stories of campaigns and conflicts spanning 4 decades. Admirals lined the rows behind him, captains, congressional representatives, family members dressed in black, all of them waiting in the kind of silence that only funerals command. Near the outer gates, Lance Corporal Idris scanned the tree line with the vigilance that came from countless hours of training. His radio squawked quietly. Perimeter secure, all verified attendees inside. He nodded to himself, adjusted his white gloves, and returned his attention to the empty road beyond the checkpoint. Nothing moved except the wind through the branches overhead. Then, from beyond the far gates, a figure appeared. An elderly man walked slowly up the access road on foot. No car, no escort. Just a solitary figure moving with deliberate purpose across the asphalt. He wore a worn canvas jacket that had seen better years, faded khakis that hung loose on a frame that had once been broader, and scuffed walking shoes that spoke of miles traveled. His gray hair was uncombed, pushed back by the wind. His face was weathered like old oak, lined with the kind of creases that came from decades of sun and sea and hard decisions. But it was his posture that caught the eye. Despite the civilian clothes, despite the age, there was something in the way he carried himself, a bearing that spoke of discipline, of watchstanding, of command. His eyes locked on the distant ceremony, specifically on the casket surrounded by honor guard and family and the machinery of military ritual. He walked toward it without hesitation, each step measured and sure. He reached the outer checkpoint, where Lieutenant Volin stood with 2 Marine guards. Valen was young, early 30s, with the kind of earnest professionalism that came from doing things by the book. He looked up from his clipboard as the old man approached, his expression polite but firm. "Sir, I'm sorry," Valen said, stepping forward slightly. "This is a restricted ceremony, family and invited guests only." The old man stopped, looked past Valen toward the ceremony, toward the casket and the flag and the assembled mourners 200 yards distant. "I know," the old man said quietly. Valen glanced at his clipboard, then back at the stranger. "Do you have credentials? An invitation?" "No." "Then I can't let you through, sir." Valen's tone remained courteous but absolute. "I'm sorry for your loss, but without proper authorization, I'm not able to grant access." The old man didn't move, didn't argue, just stood there, looking past the checkpoint toward the ceremony with an expression that was difficult to read. Not anger, not confusion. Something deeper. Something that looked like duty unfulfilled. "I need to be there," the old man said finally. Valen checked his clipboard again, running his finger down the approved list. "What's your name, sir?" Garrick Holloway." Valen scanned the names. Nothing matched. He lifted his radio and called the command post, repeating the name. The response came back negative. No Garrick Holloway on any list. No credentials on file. No invitation issued. "Sir," Valen said, lowering the radio, "there's no Garrick Holloway on the approved list. Were you expecting an invitation?" The old man met his eyes for the first time. No. The answer hung in the air between them. Valen exchanged glances with the Marines flanking him. This was straightforward. An old man, perhaps confused, perhaps presumptuous, but either way, someone without authorization trying to access a high-security military funeral. Protocol was clear. "I understand you may have known the Admiral," Valen said, his voice softer now. "But without clearance, I can't permit access to the ceremony. If you'd like, I direct you to the public memorial service scheduled for next week." "I won't be here next week," Garrick said. Something in the way he said it made Valen pause. Not defiant, not cryptic, just factual. A statement of circumstance. "Sir," Valen tried again. "Did you serve with Admiral Mercier?" "Long time ago." "What unit?" "Doesn't matter now." The evasion registered as suspicion in Valen's mind. Standard security training, vague answers, refusal to provide specifics. These were warning signs. Marine Guard Idris stepped closer, his hand resting casually near his radio. "Sir," Idris said, his voice firm, but not hostile. "We're going to need you to step back from the perimeter." Garrick didn't move, just kept looking toward the ceremony, the casket, the flag rippling in the wind, the honor guard standing at parade rest. Nearby, some of the outer attendees began to notice. A Navy commander whispered to a colleague. A staffer glanced over, frowning. The disturbance was small but spreading, like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped in still water. Valen's radio crackled. Command wanted a status update. He lifted it, keeping his eyes on Garrick. "Sir," Valen said, his tone firmer now. "I'm asking you one more time. Please step back." "I understand," Garrick said quietly. "Then you need to leave. Now." Garrick shifted slightly, and as he did, his jacket opened just enough to reveal the edge of something in the inside pocket, a faded photograph. The corner of what looked like an old military ID card. Idris caught the glimpse of it, and something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. A question forming. "Sir," Idris said, his voice lower. "Were you Navy?" "Once." "What rank?" "Doesn't matter anymore," Garrick said. Idris glanced at Valen, but the lieutenant was already making a decision. The manual was clear. No credentials meant no entry. Compassion didn't override security. "Sir," Valen said sharply, "I don't know who you are or what your relationship was with Admiral Mercier, but the family decides who attends. You're not on the list. That's final." Garrick turned as if to leave, took 2 slow steps back toward the road, then stopped. He looked back one more time, not at the guards, not at the checkpoint, but at the casket, framed by honor guard and autumn sky, draped in the flag he'd spent a lifetime serving. "He'd want me here," Garrick said quietly, almost to himself. That presumption, that claim to know the Admiral's wishes, tipped the balance. Valen lifted his radio. "Command, this is Gate 3. We have a situation. Unidentified male, 70s, no credentials, refusing to comply. Requesting backup for removal." The radio crackled. "Copy. Sending additional personnel." Within a minute, 2 more Marines arrived. Staff Sergeant Kyle led them. A career NCO with the kind of presence that came from 2 decades of handling difficult situations. He assessed Garrick with a single glance. Old, unarmed, non-threatening, but non-compliant. "Sir," Kale said, his voice firm but measured, "we're going to need you to come with us. Now." "I'm not causing trouble," Garrick said. "You're disrupting a military funeral. That's enough." More attendees were turning now. A Navy captain frowned from his position near the inner rows. A staffer checked her phone, perhaps wondering if this was some kind of security threat. The disturbance was no longer subtle. It was becoming a spectacle. Garrick didn't resist as the Marines moved to either side of him. He just stood there, shoulders straight despite his years, looking past them all toward the ceremony he'd traveled so far to attend. As they began to guide him away, his jacket shifted again. Idris saw it clearly this time, the faded photograph tucked in the pocket, the worn military ID, the edge of something that looked like old submarine qualification dolphins, tarnished with age. "Staff Sergeant," Idris said hesitantly. "Maybe we should verify his service record before we remove him completely." "We have our orders, Marine," Cale said without looking back. "But sir, if he actually served with the Admiral, wouldn't the family want to know? The family would have invited him if they wanted him here. Now, stand your post." Garrick allowed himself to be walked backward, away from the ceremony, toward the outer gates and the road beyond. His face showed no anger, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance, as if he'd expected this all along, and that would have been the end of it. An old veteran turned away, a failure of paperwork, a footnote to a ceremony that would proceed without him. Except at that moment, far across the cemetery near the casket itself, General Rowan Ashford shifted his weight and turned his head. He'd been peripherally aware of the disturbance at the outer gate, security handling something. Standard procedure. Nothing that required his attention. But now, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he looked directly toward the commotion. His eyes found the old man being escorted away. The worn jacket, the civilian clothes, the posture that somehow, despite everything, still carried the unmistakable bearing of command. Ashford's expression changed, confusion first, then concentration, then something that looked like recognition, trying to break through 40 years of fog. The aide beside him whispered, "Sir, is everything all right?" Ashford didn't answer. He was staring at the distant figure, at the way the man moved, at something in his silhouette that pulled at memories buried deep. "That walk," Ashford murmured. "Sir, that man, at the gate, who was that?" The aide glanced toward the perimeter. "Just a security issue, sir. They're handling it." But Ashford wasn't listening anymore. He took one step forward, breaking formation slightly. His jaw worked as he watched the old man being led away. "It can't be," he said quietly, almost to himself. "General," the protocol officer said urgently, "the ceremony is about to proceed." Ashford raised his hand, the universal military signal to stop. "Hold the ceremony," he said. "Sir?" Ashford's voice cut across the entire cemetery, sharp and commanding. "Hold the ceremony." 300 people froze. The chaplain stopped mid-gesture. The honor guard stood rigid, confused. Admirals exchanged shocked glances. Politicians looked around, bewildered. The family in the front row turned, uncertain what was happening. Ashford didn't look at any of them. His eyes were locked on the distant gate where 4 Marines surrounded one old man. "I said, hold," Ashford repeated, his voice brooking no argument. Then he started walking, not toward the casket, not toward the family, but toward the perimeter, toward the man being turned away. His boots crushed grass as he moved between rows of graves, past monuments to the fallen, toward a truth that was beginning to dawn with the force of revelation. At the outer gate, the Marines saw the 4-star approaching and snapped to attention. "Attention!" one of them called sharply. Ashford ignored them. He walked straight past the checkpoint, past the security perimeter, until he stood 5 feet from Garrick Holloway. The 2 men looked at each other, the general in full-dress uniform, stars gleaming. The old man in worn civilian clothes, dust on his shoes from the long walk. "Rowan," Garrick said softly. Ashford's face went through a dozen emotions in 3 seconds. Disbelief, shock, recognition, something that looked dangerously close to tears. "Holy God," Ashford whispered. "Garrick, if you've ever been denied something you earned, share your story in the comments below. And if this moment moved you, consider subscribing for stories that honor those who serve in silence." The wind picked up across Arlington, scattering more leaves between the headstones. 300 people stood frozen in place, watching a 4-star general and an old man in civilian clothes stare at each other across 5 feet of ground that suddenly felt like a chasm, bridging decades. Staff Sergeant Cale stood rigid, his hand still resting on Garrick's arm. Lieutenant Valen had gone pale, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side. Marine Idris looked between the general and the stranger, trying to piece together what was happening. "Sir," Cale began, his voice uncertain, "this man doesn't have credentials. He's not on the approved list. Protocol required us to remove him from the premises." Ashford didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on Garrick, and his jaw worked like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. Finally, he managed to. "Stand down, sir." The general's voice hardened into the command tone that had ordered fleets and ended arguments for 4 decades. "I said, stand down, Staff Sergeant." The Marines stepped back immediately, their hands dropping to their sides. Valen took an uncertain step backward, still clutching his clipboard like it might offer some explanation for what was unfolding. Ashford's expression cycled through emotions too fast to catalog. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Sir," he said, quietly, the word carrying across the silence like a gunshot. "What are you doing out here?" That single word hung in the air. "Sir." From a 4-star general to a man in worn khakis and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. Garrick's voice was steady, quiet, came to pay my respects. Ashford gestured vaguely toward the ceremony, toward the casket and the honor guard and the family waiting in confused silence. "Then why aren't you?" he started, then stopped as understanding hit him. His face darkened. "They didn't let you in. No invitation." Ashford closed his eyes, his hands balled into fists at his sides, then slowly relaxed. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with something that might have been anger or grief or both. "Did you tell them who you were?" Didn't seem important. A sound escaped Ashford's throat that was almost a laugh, but carried no humor. "Didn't seem important." Jesus Christ, Garrick. 40 years and you haven't changed at all. He turned sharply to Lieutenant Valen, who straightened reflexively under the sudden attention. "Lieutenant, you denied this man entry to the ceremony?" Valen's voice came out strained. "Sir, I followed protocol. He wasn't on the verified guest list. He had no credentials, no authorization. Security procedures require that anyone without proper clearance be turned away from restricted military ceremonies. Do you know who this is?" "No, sir," Valen said. He wouldn't identify himself beyond giving his name. Ashford turned back to Garrick. A question passed between them without words. Garrick gave a small nod. Permission granted. The general faced the small crowd that had gathered at the perimeter. Guards, officers who'd moved closer to see what had stopped the ceremony. Junior staffers with phones half raised, uncertain whether to document or respect the moment. "This is Captain Garrick Holloway," Ashford said, his voice carrying with the clarity of parade ground announcements. "United States Navy, retired." A pause, people waiting. The title captain meant something, but not enough to explain why a 4-star general had halted an admiral's funeral. Commander of USS Requiem, fast attack submarine, South China Sea operations, 1980s. Some of the older officers reacted, eyes widening, postures straightening. The name Requiem sparked recognition in faces that had heard the stories, read the classified reports, known the legend. Ashford's voice grew stronger. Captain Holloway was Admiral Mercier's first commanding officer. Murmurs rippled through the assembled group. A Navy captain near the inner perimeter turned to whisper to a colleague. Staffers exchanged confused glances. The family, still seated near the casket 200 yards away, couldn't hear the words, but could see the disruption, the frozen ceremony, the general speaking with intensity to someone they couldn't identify. "But that's not the whole story," Ashford continued, his jaw clenched. "August 1987. USS Requiem was operating at classified depth on patrol when a hydraulic line ruptured in the engine room. The submariners in the crowd went still. This was every sailor's nightmare. Fire, confined space, hundreds of feet below the surface with nowhere to run. The fire spread to the reactor compartment within minutes. No time to surface. No way to evacuate. 300 feet of ocean above us and a nuclear reactor starting to overheat below." Ashford's voice dropped slightly, but every word carried. Lieutenant Dalton Mercier was 23 years old, junior officer, engineering division. He was in the aft section when it happened. Garrick stood silent, his face unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. A tightness around his eyes, a weight settling on shoulders that had carried it before. "Captain Holloway ordered an emergency evacuation," Ashford said. "Got 17 men, including Mercier, into the aft torpedo room. sealed the bulkhead behind them to contain the fire and radiation. Then he went back, Ashford said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. Someone in the crowd made a sound, shock or disbelief or both. Into the reactor compartment, alone. Sealed himself inside manually while the crew evacuated to the aft safe zone. The silence was absolute now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Temperature in that compartment reached 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Smoke so thick visibility was measured in inches. Radiation alarms screaming, and Captain Holloway stayed there for 47 minutes, manually stabilizing the reactor, rerouting coolant, preventing a meltdown that would have killed everyone aboard. Ashford looked at Garrick's wrist, at the watch he still wore. The scarred metal case that had survived something watches weren't built to survive. The heat melted his watch band to his skin, fused the metal and leather into his wrist. He still has the scars. Garrick shifted almost imperceptibly, his left hand moving to cover his right wrist in a gesture that was more reflex than conscious thought. A young ensign near the back couldn't contain himself. How did he survive? Ashford's answer was quiet, barely. By the time the reactor stabilized and the temperature dropped enough for the crew to breach the compartment, he'd collapsed from heat exhaustion. Second and third degree burns across his arms. Smoke inhalation severe enough that they thought he'd never speak normally again. They medevaced him to Okinawa Naval Hospital in critical condition. The general paused. 6 weeks later, he was back on active duty. Disbelief rippled through the listeners. 6 weeks from critical condition to active service was impossible by any medical standard. Yet here stood the man who done it. An older admiral near the front, his hair silver and his uniform bearing the insignia of submarine service, spoke up. The Requiem incident. I remember now. It was classified for decades. Level 4 security clearance required even to acknowledge it happened. Still is, officially, Ashford confirmed. The only reason it's not anymore is because Dalton requested it be declassified before he died. He wanted people to know what Captain Holloway did. He turned back to the assembled group, his voice hardening. The Navy offered Captain Holloway the Medal of Honor. He refused it, refused the Navy Cross, refused every commendation, every interview, every public acknowledgement. Said he was just doing his job. Garrick's voice was quiet, but carried. I was. Your job was to command the boat, Ashford said, turning to face him directly. Not to die in it. The crew was my responsibility, Garrick replied simply. Ashford's composure wavered. Dalton Mercier was in that aft torpedo room, with 17 other men, who lived because you stayed. The general's voice grew thick. He spent 38 years trying to become half the officer you were, Garrick. He told me that. The night before he died, in the hospital, when he knew he was going. Garrick's expression shifted for the first time, something that might have been pain crossing his weathered features. He said, "Find Captain Holloway," Ashford continued. "Make sure he's at my funeral. Tell him he's the reason I lived long enough to have one." The words landed like an anchor. Ashford's hands were shaking slightly now, and he clasped them behind his back to hide it. "I tried, sir. I swear to God I tried. Called every Navy contact I had. Checked every database. But you disappeared after you retired. No forwarding address, no contact information, no trace." Garrick spoke quietly. Wasn't hiding, just living quiet. "How did you even find out about the funeral? Saw it in the newspaper. Obituary section. Took 3 buses to get here." The statement fell into the silence like a stone into still water. 3 buses. A journey of hours. Public transit. For a man in his late 70s who'd saved the life of an admiral and asked for nothing in return. Ashford closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. 3 buses, and we turned you away at the gate. Lieutenant Volin looked like he wanted the earth to open beneath him. Staff Sergeant Cale stood rigid, his face a mask of professional composure, barely containing shock. Marine Idris had his hand over his mouth. Ashford turned to the Marines, his voice shifting back to command mode. "Escort Captain Holloway to the front row, immediately." Garrick shook his head slightly. "Rowan, I don't need special treatment. I just wanted to pay my respects from a distance." "Sir," Ashford said, and the word carried weight beyond rank or protocol. "With all due respect, I'm not asking." The 2 men locked eyes. Decades of separation collapsed into a moment of understanding. Finally, Garrick spoke. The family. They don't know me. I don't want to intrude on their grief. Dalton's son is here, Commander Jace Mercier. He knows the story. His father made sure of it. Garrick hesitated, uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Ashford's voice softened. Captain, you taught Dalton what it meant to stay, even when it cost everything, even when walking away would have been easier and safer and more reasonable. He paused, letting the words settle. Don't leave now. The plea hung between them. Around them, the cemetery had gone absolutely still. No wind, no sound. Just the weight of history pressing down on grass and stone, and the living who stood among monuments to the dead. Garrick looked past Ashford toward the distant casket, toward the flag rippling in a breeze that had returned as suddenly as it had vanished, toward the ceremony that had been stopped for him. All right, he said quietly. Staff Sergeant Cale stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine respect that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Sir, it would be an honor to escort you. Garrick met his eyes and nodded once. The walk began. Garrick flanked by Marines who minutes ago had been removing him from the premises. Ashford beside him, 4 stars gleaming in the autumn sun. The small group moved across Arlington between rows of white headstones, past monuments to wars and conflicts that spanned generations. As they walked, something remarkable happened. An older admiral near the aisle saw them approaching, saw Garrick's face. Recognition sparked in his eyes, and he rose from his seat, stood at attention, raised his hand in salute. The gesture was unauthorized, unplanned, against protocol for a funeral in progress. But then a captain 2 rows back stood, saluted, then a commander, then a lieutenant, then entire sections rising like a wave spreading across the assembled mourners. Ashford glanced at the spontaneous display, then at Garrick. They remember, he said quietly. They shouldn't have to, Garrick replied, his voice tight. They reached the front row where Commander Jace Mercier sat beside his mother and siblings. Jace was in his mid-30s, navy dress blues crisp, his chest bearing decorations that echoed his father's service. His eyes were red from grief, his face drawn from days of funeral preparations and the weight of loss. He looked up as the group approached, saw his father's flag-draped casket, saw General Ashford, then saw the old man in civilian clothes walking beside him. Jace's face went through a transformation, confusion, closer examination, then sudden, overwhelming recognition. He stood so quickly his chair scraped against the grass. Captain Holloway? Garrick's voice was gentle. I'm sorry for your loss, Commander. Jace stood frozen for a moment, then extended his hand, changed his mind mid-gesture, and brought it up in a salute instead. Garrick returned it slowly, precisely, with the kind of form that came from decades of muscle memory. My father, Jace began, then stopped. His voice broke. He told me everything, about the requiem, about what you did. He said I should find you someday, and thank you for giving him a life. You don't owe me thanks, Garrick said. He said you'd say that, Jace replied, and something like a smile flickered across his grief-stricken face. Ashford addressed the entire assembly, his voice carrying across the cemetery. Before we continue this ceremony, I'm ordering a moment of silence. Not for the Admiral we're burying, but for the captain who made him. 300 people stood, civilians, officers, family, all rising in waves of movement that rustled like wind through wheat. 1 minute, Ashford said. Beginning now. The silence that fell was absolute. No radios, no whispers. Just wind and the distant sound of traffic beyond the cemetery walls and the collective held breath of hundreds. Garrick stood beside the casket, hand over his heart, eyes closed. The flag rippled above Dalton Mercier's remains. The honor guard held position, statues in uniform. Jace Mercier stood with tears streaming down his face, watching the man his father had spent a lifetime honoring. 60 seconds felt like an hour, like a heartbeat, like the span between one life and another. When it ended, Ashford lowered his hand. Thank you, Captain. Garrick opened his eyes, nodded once. The ceremony will now continue, Ashford announced. But as people returned to their seats and the chaplain prepared to resume, everyone understood that something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just Admiral Mercier's funeral. It was a reckoning with gratitude, with sacrifice, with the debts we carry and the grace of those who never ask for payment. Garrick took a seat beside Jace in the front row, the worn canvas jacket among dress uniforms, the civilian among military, the man who'd saved a life sitting beside the family that life had created. And across the cemetery, Lieutenant Valen stood at his post, watching. His hands were shaking. His clipboard hung at his side, useless now. He had followed every protocol, done everything right, and still nearly committed an unforgivable wrong. If someone's sacrifice changed your life, but they never asked for recognition, tell us about them in the comments. Subscribe to hear more stories of those who serve in silence and dignity. The chaplain stepped forward once more, his voice carrying across the rows of assembled mourners. We gather to honor a man of service, a leader who commanded with wisdom, a warrior who understood the cost of duty. The words flowed over the crowd, but every eye kept drifting toward the front row, toward the old man in civilian clothes sitting beside the Admiral's son, toward the living embodiment of a story most had never heard. Admiral Dalton Mercier's life was shaped by the men he served with, the chaplain continued, by those who taught him what leadership truly meant, not in theory, but in fire and pressure, and moments when choices define everything that follows. Jace Mercier glanced at Garrick, then back at his father's casket. His mother reached across and took Garrick's hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. The honor guard stepped forward, in perfect unison. 8 Marines in dress blues, white gloves pristine, movement synchronized to the millisecond. Present arms, the officer commanded. The crack of the rifle volley shattered the morning quiet. 21 times the sound echoed across Arlington, rolling between headstones and monuments, announcing to the dead that another had joined their ranks. Garrick didn't flinch. His eyes stayed forward, hand over heart, watching with the stillness of someone who'd stood at too many funerals, who'd saluted too many caskets, who'd memorized the sound of gunfire announcing the end of service. The bugler raised his instrument. The first notes of taps floated across the cemetery, haunting and pure. A single tear tracked down Garrick's weathered cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. The honor guard began folding the flag, each movement deliberate, ceremonial. The fabric that had covered Dalton Mercier's casket was transformed through precise folds into a tight triangle. When the folding was complete, the honor guard captain turned past Jace. To Garrick. "Sir," he said quietly. The Admiral left specific instructions. Garrick looked up, confusion crossing his face. "No, that belongs to his son." The captain's voice was respectful, but firm. "Sir, the Admiral requested that if you were present at his funeral, you were to receive his flag." Garrick looked at Jace, who nodded through fresh tears. "He wanted you to have it," Jace said, his voice breaking. "My father spent his whole life trying to repay a debt. This is the closest he could come." Garrick's hands shook slightly as he accepted the flag. He held it against his chest, and his shoulders trembled once before he regained control. As the final prayers were spoken, Garrick stood. He moved slowly to the casket, placing one weathered hand on the polished wood. He leaned close, his lips moving in words no one else could hear. A private conversation between a captain and the junior officer he'd saved. When Garrick straightened, he stepped back. His hand rose in salute, the movement crisp despite his age. He held it there, steady and unwavering. The salute lasted for 10 seconds that felt like minutes. Then his hand lowered, and he returned to his seat. The ceremony concluded. People began to approach the family, and many approached Garrick as well. An admiral stopped before him. "I served under you for 6 months on the Requin, sir. Lieutenant Torrance, Fire Control Division." Garrick studied his face. "You were a good officer. I remember good officers." The admiral saluted, holding it until Garrick returned it. Others came. A captain who'd heard the story from Dalton years ago. A young ensign who'd researched submarine safety. A congressman who'd served as a naval officer and understood what 47 minutes in a reactor compartment meant. Garrick accepted each greeting with quiet grace, uncomfortable with the attention, but too polite to refuse it. Jace appeared as the crowd thinned. "Captain, there's a reception. My mother would very much like you to attend." Garrick shook his head gently. "I don't want to intrude on your family's time. This is your day to remember your father." General Ashford materialized at his elbow. "I'm having a car take you home. Rowan, that's not necessary. It's not a request, sir. The two men locked eyes, and finally Garrick allowed himself a small smile. You always were stubborn. Learned from the best, Ashford replied. They walked together toward the cemetery gates, Garrick still carrying the folded flag. As they passed the outer checkpoint, Lieutenant Valen stood at rigid attention. He removed his cover and saluted, holding it long past protocol. Garrick stopped, returned the salute. Sir, Valen said quietly, I'm sorry. I didn't know. You did your job, Lieutenant, Garrick replied. You protected a ceremony honoring a good man. There's nothing to apologize for. Still, I should have asked more questions. Garrick's voice was gentle but firm. Lieutenant, the best junior officers are the ones who follow protocol even when it's hard. You did that. Be proud of it. Valen's throat worked. Thank you, sir. At the main gates, Ashford's car waited. Garrick paused before getting in, looking back one last time at the cemetery, at the rows of white headstones, at the place where Dalton Mercier would rest. He'll have good company, Ashford said quietly. He always did, Garrick replied. The car pulled away. Ashford watched it disappear down the tree-lined road, then turned back toward the cemetery, toward the duty that remained. 3 days later, workers installed Admiral Dalton Mercier's headstone. Standard military issue, name, rank, dates of service. But beside the headstone, Jace Mercier placed something additional, a small plaque, privately commissioned. The inscription was simple, saved by Captain Garrick Holloway, USS Requiem, August 1987, never forgotten. Because some debts transcend repayment. Some sacrifices exist beyond the reach of medals, or ceremonies, or official recognition. Lieutenant Valen requested a transfer to submarine service 6 weeks after the funeral. When asked why, he said he wanted to serve with people who understood what duty actually meant, and Garrick Holloway returned to his quiet life, to a small apartment where nobody knew his name or his history, to peaceful anonymity he'd always preferred. But on his wall, in a simple frame, hung the flag that had covered Dalton Mercier's casket, and beside it, a photograph from 1987, a submarine crew standing on a dock. In the center, a younger Garrick in uniform, and beside him, a junior officer named Dalton Mercier, grinning at the camera like he had his whole life ahead of him, which, because of what happened 3 months later, he did. The flag caught the afternoon light sometimes, and if you looked closely at Garrick's wrist when he adjusted it, you could see the scars. Faint now, faded by time but never truly gone. Some marks last, some debts endure, and some stories, even when buried under decades of silence, find their way back to the light. If this story reminded you of someone who served quietly, who sacrificed without seeking credit, share their memory below. Subscribe to honor those whose greatest acts were the ones they never spoke about.